Good afternoon and welcome to Virtuacon 14. I am Jim McClure and I'm going to be presenting here a wonderful, well, we've been calling most of these things panels, but as you see, there's no one else around. It's just me here talking today. And that's because this is more of a workshop or a presentation, if you will. And what we're going to be talking about today is the 8 steps to building a plot. And we're getting to exactly what that means, but we're going to do a little bit of housework first. Of course, my name is Jim McClure. I am the content manager at the Roll20 GM Academy. We produce these kind of videos to help educate both DMs and players in a better way, or no, I should say a better way to tabletop, but presenting tools and information to use to help them with a game experience. And today, what of course we're presenting is this 8 steps to building a plot. This course is going to be sort of a paint by number system that can be used for anyone to build a plot. And I want to understand a couple things going into this. I'm not saying this is the best way to build a plot. I'm not saying it's a bad way to build a plot either. I'm not saying this is the only way to build a plot. I'm saying this is a way to build a plot. This is a system that anyone can use. It does not require creativity. This is a tool bag for you to use to make an interesting, engaging plot. Because one of the common misconceptions within tabletop, within literature, within writing, everything that we do is that plot comes from this burst of inspiration and originality. No, it is a set of tools that you learn to use and you learn to craft with. And I'm going to present you a set of tools to use today. The one last thing before we jump into it that I want to get to with housekeeping, in test, I've had a little bit of intermittent mic issue. And as I've got a 10-second delay before I hear myself back, I'm not going to really know if there's issues till it happens. So if all of a sudden I start sounding super staticky, I apologize, but we'll see how that goes. So jumping into it here, we are going to talk about the first step in building a plot. And our first step is what we call choosing a metastructure. Now, choosing a metastructure is essentially the overarching concept of what your campaign is. And there is 4 metastructures. Our 4 metastructures are a dungeon crawler, what I call D&D hard mode. That's the classic. You're going down to the dungeon. It's super difficult. You're going through all of that, and survival and loot collecting is essentially your goal. And that is one type of metastructure. Your second type of metastructure is a linear plot. And there's a difference between linear plot and between railroading. These are completely different things and a topic for another day. But linear plot is a good, useful method for telling a story. And it is not railroading. They are different things. The next thing that we have are essentially 2 different types of sandboxes, and that is mini sandbox and true sandbox. In a mini sandbox, what you're doing is giving the players free reign, but within a certain parameter. So the example of this would be if you ran a city, and the city is fully fleshed out, and there's the river and the docks down here and the big castle up on the hill and the farms out on the side, and you players are allowed to go and do whatever they want in this city, but they're kind of to a degree restricted to just being in the city itself. A true sandbox is your full open world. You can do whatever you want. You want to hop on a ship and sail to the next continent, you're welcome to do it. You want to stay right here in this one cave and not do anything else, you're welcome to do that too. So our very first step when we are designing the plot is we need to understand what meta structure we are using. Are we doing a dungeon crawl? Are we doing a linear plot? Are we doing a mini sandbox? Or are we doing a true sandbox? Those are the steps that really determine so much of what everything else builds on, because you're going to design a campaign where we're going to go and fight the giant, the evil wizard and get back the princess or whatever we're using. We're going to design that campaign differently if it's a dungeon crawl or if it is a mini sandbox. We're going to do it completely differently. So our base, our foundation is what type of system are we doing? Once we have our metastructure established, we are then going to go into our second step, which is choosing a dramatic situation. Now, dramatic situation is what a lot of people understand as a plot, but it is one step of the plot. We're going to talk on that in a little bit. A dramatic situation is essentially the main thrust of what's going on. It is what is the main core engagement that's happening within your story. Now, there's a guy named Georges Polti that back in the 19th century, he wrote an article in French, it was later translated to English, that said that there are 36 dramatic situations. And that's it in the world. That's all that there is. And to give you a sample of what he's talking about: pursuit, disaster, falling prey to cruelty, crime pursued by vengeance. These are all examples of some of his: abduction, enemy of a kin, rivalry of a kin. There are 36 of them that he holds are all encompassing. Now, that is a ongoing literary debate in and of itself, but Georges Polti's 36 dramatic situations are a fantastic starting point for you as a DM to go through and pick out one that interests you. You go, you have a look, and you go, okay, kidnapping, that's my dramatic situation. We have rivalry of warlords, that's my dramatic situation. And again, you can argue whether there's more or less than 36, but it is a great starting point to go and look at these dramatic situations. So step one, we figure out what is our metastructure, our foundation. Step two is how are we going to build on that foundation, that dramatic situation, which is going to tell us the story throughout the rest of this story arc. Now, I want to pause here and talk about something real quick, because I see this quite frequently on forums and message boards and everything of the like, and that is when someone is having trouble with a story, they don't have players engaged in their story, whatever the case may be, a lot of times people are giving advice: oh, well, why don't you try a thieves guild? Or, oh, why don't you have the king captured? Or, oh, why don't you do this? And all of that is actually doing is suggesting a different dramatic situation to people because it's worked for people in the past. The reality is, the secret of it all is there is no dramatic situation that's better than others. They're all equal. It's all how you build and use them. And just changing dramatic situations is not going to fix any problems with a campaign. It's not going to fix character engagement and plot. It is merely changing dramatic situation. So I want to take the time to say that note. And then the other note I want to make on dramatic situation is there is a very common dramatic situation used within the tabletop world. It's called the quest. We almost always call our plots quests. And that is go and get the thing to get reward for thing. That's a quest. It's your dramatic situation. It's a good one. It's why it's been used over and over again. But understand, it is only one of the 36 plus, depending on your preference, types of dramatic situations. So I really encourage DMs, spread out more, do more, see different types of dramatic situations you can run. And the last takeaway on our dramatic situation, the last thing I want to point out with it is that understand the difference of a dramatic situation is not a plot. It is one of 8 steps in building a plot. It is not the entirety of the plot. So remember that. Keep it. It's dire to keep, because just coming up with a king getting kidnapped, you have not come up with a plot. You've come up with a dramatic situation, one of the base levels of foundation, but not a plot itself. So again, where we are, our first step, we have our foundation, we have our metastructure established. Our second step, we're deciding what kind of metastructure that we want to build. Then we are going to get into the next step, and this is something that is often overlooked, very often overlooked, and that is how long will the plot last? I want you to think about that for a second. I am suggesting that from the beginning of the campaign, you determine how long it will last. And the reason for this is it is something that most other forms of entertainment have figured out, and they've gotten to a sweet spot. And that is the 12 to 15 hour sweet spot. That's how long the average person reads the average length novel. That's how much amount of television there is on the average season. Somewhere close to that 12 to 15 hour mark. We've learned that human beings can only be engaged within a story arc for so long before they start to lose interest in it, because it's simply drug on too long. And if you go into a plot with the idea it's open-ended and it can last forever, you really open it up to player fatigue. You open it up to a situation where the players never feel like they accomplish a finale, that they don't feel like something is really progressing. It's just we're in this constant state of plot arc. And it really does not bode well to long-term campaigns. Me personally, what I personally advise, this is not a rule by any means, is things take place a little bit slower than tabletop. You've got encounters that takes time. I go for 15 to 20 hours. That's what my plot is. 15 to 20 hours. I normally do 4-hour play sessions, so we're somewhere in 4 to 5 play session campaigns. Now, important thing, and we'll get to this, of course, later on, that is not the entire. I'm not saying you should never have a campaign that runs longer than that. I'm saying there should be individual story arcs that take place, escalate, and conclude within 4 to 5 play sessions. I've run ones that are much longer. I've run ones that are much shorter. You can do one-shots. But there is something that we have discovered within the rest of the world of entertainment, that there is only this certain amount of time that we can maintain engage. And the more you push that, the more you risk player fatigue. So the big thing to understand on step 3, we have our foundations. We know what kind of story we're telling. We know the metastructure of the story. How long of a story am I going to tell? And obviously it's tabletop, and we all know this. Players will change things up. Things will be shifted from this way to another. But the thing you want to understand is go towards a goal, go towards an endpoint, go towards a finale. Because if you don't do that, you're going to drag on forever and then not know how to conclude it. And conclusion is the best thing in the world for continued story. So I build my 4 to 5 play sessions. I have my story arc. It ends, and what immediately happens the next play session? It's the first play session of the next story arc, which picks up on the overarching story to where we are. It continues where we're going with its own story arc, and that allows for completion of players. It allows for finale. It allows for high and low points within the campaign, and it allows for long-term campaigns. My L5R campaign, I just tallied up, it's 3 years and 9 months that I've been doing 4 to 5 play sessions at a time. Some have been longer. We do big end of the year things that go, even 8 play sessions. So it's not a definitive rule, but it is definitely something to be aware of, and that a lot of people do not put much focus into when they're making their campaigns. So I'd very much encourage you, when you're building the campaign, my 3rd step is establish how long you want this plot to last. And I would warn you about making it too long. So once we get past that, then we start getting into the real meat and potatoes, the fun thing, which is step 4, establishing the participants of the plot. And I would also like to say, as I'm talking here, I know some of you are listening to me. We have the Q&A feature up. If there's anything you have questions or like to add comments on, hit the Q&A feature, and I'll be happy to answer any of those as we're talking through this, just as a point of interest. But yeah, step 4, establishing the participants of the plot. This is where we get to a stage where now we know what's happening. We know how long it's going to happen. We know our metastructure. Who are the people involved? And within a tabletop storytelling, the most important people involved are the PCs. I'm sure this is not breaking news to anyone. The focus needs to be on the PCs and PC action. So when we establish our participants of the plot, we follow another one of the things that television and to a degree not as much literature has established, and that is the rule of 7. See, I love numbers, 8, 7, 36. We like to throw them all out there. 7 participants to your plot. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. In our 7 participants, what we are going to have is we are going to have 2 forces of good, 2 forces of evil, 2 neutral forces, and 1 wild card. And this is what you want to build towards. Now, generally, in a standard tabletop situation, the heroes are going to be a force of good. We're going to have a villain as a force of evil. We are going to have other forces like merchants guilds and plundering goblins that are just doing it for their own thing that are going to fall under the neutral force. And of course, we'll talk into wild card a little bit later on. But I want to start with establishing what a force is. A force can either be a person or a group of people that are acting essentially in unison. So to give you an example of this, let's say we have an evil kingdom that we're breaking to, and there's an evil king and he's a tyrant, and we have to save the land, and that's our dramatic situation. Removing of the oppression of evil. That's our dramatic situation. So we come in and then we learn there's the king and the king's guard. And the king's guard will never do anything against the king. If he says, kill all of those orphans, they're going to go and kill all the orphans. Period, it's done. The king and all of his guards are one force, one of our forces of evil, because they essentially act with the exact same motivation. They act in unison, and there's not going to be any divisiveness between them. Now, let's say the king has a son, but that king's son is also into oppressing the people for whatever reason, but he thinks the king shouldn't be as focused on his town and should be focused on expanding. He is now no longer part of that force. He is his own force. He is his own participant in the plot, because while generally he lines up with the other participant of evil, there is some conflict. There's a little bit of tension between them. That's a big important thing. That's what distinguishes groups from being in the same force and groups that are different, because now the son, while he agrees that he's going to lay down the law and he's going to make sure that the peasants till their fields 16 hours a day, he's also at odds with the king because he thinks they should be expanding as opposed to staying together. So that's to understand the different forces. A force can be a singular person, or it can be a group of people, but that all act within unison. What we need to build is 7 of these in our plot. Yeah, it's a big number to start out with. 7 forces allows enough different connections of conflict to occur to develop a fully engaging world. So on one side, we have our forces of good, and we need 2 forces of good. And again, the difference in forces is slightly different motivations. And based on who your players are, they may fill only one of the forces of good, or they may fill both forces of good. If some of the players are trying to do this and some of the players are trying to do this, but the things are a little bit different. And you're going to have to know your players and know what kind of characters they're bringing and what kind of backstories they're bringing to know whether they're going to fill one or both forces of good. Because again, you want the forces of good conflicting the forces of evil, but a little bit of tension between allies. So first thing to establish, those forces of good. We know our heroes in most standard plot structures are going to be filling, at least one, if not both. If they're not filling both, you need to make another force that has the same primary desire as the other force of good. In our story, if the players are coming in to overthrow the king and to overthrow the prince that are oppressing, the other force of good needs to have that same goal. But the heroes might be coming and doing it just for a pure altruistic standpoint, while the other forces of good might be coming to do it because it will open trade routes to the next town. So therefore, when the PCs want to burn down the shipping routes to slow down the villains, the other force of good is going to stand in their way, and there's going to be a little bit of tension. We both want the same thing, but we have different motivations for it. Those are our forces of good. On the other side, we have our forces of evil. We have our bad guys. We have our people that are directly opposed to the good guys. And there needs to be 2 of those forces, normally a primary and a secondary enemy, sort of like the king and prince that we talked about earlier. That's sort of the ideal dynamic of they both are oppressing. They are both in direct conflict with the forces of good, but there's enough to have a little extra tension. It allows the players to maybe try and play that tension off of each other. It allows the villains to play the tension off of each other of the 2 other players. We start to see how all of the lines start to intermingle, and we get opportunity for good role play and opportunity for good big set pieces to happen. And we'll get into set pieces in a minute. But that's only 4 of our 7. We have more than that. We have 2 neutral forces. Neutral forces are forces that are powerful in the world. And again, powerful can mean anything from a military force to a political force to just a resource in and of itself, like a pile of gold or treasure sitting somewhere. It can be anything in that range, but it is some force with power that is not directly invested in the main conflict between the other forces. So good guys over here, bad guys over here, neutral forces up here out of the way of the conflict. Now, what the neutral forces are here to do is to allow the good guys and the bad guys to volley for essentially the power of the neutral force to help them. An example would be in this story that we're building. Our heroes have come in to save the town. The kings are oppressing. There is the established merchant guild. The merchant guild does not agree with the king and the heavy taxation. But they're not about to support these new rebels that are going to come in and upheave and change everything. They're going to sit on the sidelines and wait it out. Now, if the heroes come to them and present that they will get, you know, a bigger standing in the new kingdom, they could be swayed to help with golden supplies. Likewise, if the villains come to them, they could attempt to sway them to help in, you know, essentially standing against the rebels and promise of lower taxes. The neutral forces are there to help flush out the world and give something for each of our opposing sides to interact with that is not direct conflict. The last one, our number 7, the guy who sits down here in our imaginary world again. Good guys over here, bad guys over here, neutral forces up here. There's the wild card, which is right down here at the bottom, right by my microphone. The wild card is a force that is one of the other 6 positions. One of the other 2 good guys, one of the other 2 good bad guys, one of the other 2 neutral forces in the next plot that has bled over into this plot. And the wild card is what you use to tie this story arc into the next story arc. And I'm not going to get too much into this because we actually talk about the wild card as step 8. But just remember, that's what they're here for. So these are the participants that we establish. There is a lot to be said about balancing out, to a degree, power levels, for lack of another term for it, between these forces. I hold most stories work best when there is equal power between them. Again, not necessarily the same power. Maybe one holds political power and one holds military power, but there needs to be a level of balance that occurs between them. Because if there is not a level of balance, then it's easier for one to just run over top of the other. And that's not what you want. It doesn't provide a realistic situation. We need to have some level of balance. Can you run campaigns without it? Absolutely. You certainly can. I have. Do you need all 7 participants every single time? No. But what I'm providing you is a paint by number system of, if we establish, here's good guy 1, here's good guy 2. Here's bad guy 1, here's bad guy 2. Here's neutral party 1, here's neutral party 2, here's wild card. And then you fill in what all of these people are and all of their motivations. You will all of a sudden see the entire world of conflict in this area open up in front of you. Every bit of it. It's almost impossible to do it without. So again, I just want to make the emphasized point. I'm not saying this is the only way, but if you go and do this, you will have an engaging plot. And the 7 participants is a big step. It's the next big thing that we make. We set all of our foundation work. We're now at a point we've set up. We know our meta structure. We know linear plot. We know sandbox. We know dungeon crawl. We know what our dramatic situation is. You know, we know that it's the king oppressing. We're going to overthrow oppression. We know how long our story is going to last, how long we expect this plot arc to last, and now we know who's involved with it. So then we get into what happens next. The first thing, actually, I stand corrected, before we get into what physically happens, we have to stop at this midpoint and do something core, which is identify the core conflict of our story. This is another thing that really gets lost in story writers sometimes. They do not stop and they do not go, what is the conflict between the villains and between the PCs? And there has to be a clear conflict of ideology or some other equally motivating factor. And let's use the example I've been talking about, the king and the prince that are oppressing the town. That's what's going on. If our players come in and they are running chaotic neutral or they are running evil characters, there's no conflict. They have to be morally opposed to I'm not even going to say that word, to oppression from above. If they are not morally opposed to that, there's no conflict. And anyone who's GM for a certain period of time will agree with me here. You cannot tell your players what they have to feel. You cannot tell them you are morally opposed to conflict. It won't work. You have to understand your characters. You have to understand your characters' motivations. You have to understand your players' motivations to set up this kind of thing. Now, you can do a more direct thing. There is the sort of the classic pirate tale, which is the lost treasure on an island. The good guys want it. The bad guys want it. Conflict occurs because we are going for the same thing and only one person can have it. Because you can't just split up treasure, right? That'd be ridiculous. No, there has to be a core conflict, and there needs to be a direct conflict that cannot be resolved between good guys and bad guys. That is what drives the story. If you do not have this, you are going to result in disinterested players. There's no way around it. It is the common pitfall of the typical sandbox campaign. I'm going to let my players come in and do whatever it is they want to do. Well, if there's no core conflict, there's nothing driving them. Yes, there are players that really enjoy it and love it and will essentially go and design and make their own conflict. But most players aren't capable of doing that, especially inexperienced players. And for the players that aren't capable of designing their own conflict from the world that you made, they are going to sit bored and uninterested in what's happening because they have no direct conflict. They have nothing to resolve. So step 5, once we have all of our participants, once we have all our metastructure, once we have our dramatic situation, we stop and we look and we make sure that there is direct conflict between what the players want to do and what the villains want to do. And that the only way to resolve it is through conflict. It needs to be established. It desperately needs to be established. So now that we know, obviously, the story that we're telling and building here, we have the king, we have the prince, we have the players. They are morally opposed to the oppression that's happening. We know we have conflict here. We know that it's going to want to be resolved. So now we start looking at making the big set pieces. Okay, a set piece. This is where some people get a little bit lost. A set piece is an event to occur in the story. This is what we really get into with a 3-act structure. We're going to talk about the 3 and the 4-act structure. But what I started to say with some DMs are not completely on board with setting up big scenes to happen in advance, because the thought process is this is railroading the players. If we establish that there is going to be the big confrontation in the courtyard, then we have to railroad our players and say you have to get to the courtyard. That's the big concern a lot of people have with set pieces. And to a degree, I want to put people's mind at ease. And this is what I was talking about earlier of linear plot versus railroading. You can set up big set pieces that the players themselves will naturally come to and do themselves. You can plan right from the beginning that they're going to do it. And this is hinged off one big core concept that I would encourage anyone to test this. And that big core concept is players will engage with the most interesting thing in their environment. I'm going to let that sit for a second. Players will engage with the most interesting thing in their environment, with one small caveat, assuming it's above a certain base level of interest. So our example that I give for this is in a situation where the players are in a town. Let's say we're doing a mini sandbox, and they are presented with 3 different quests. And one of these quests is go and reclaim furniture from an evil tax collector. And one of these quests is the peasants' goats have broken out, and he's offering money to get his goats back. And one of these quests is to pull the magic sword out of the stone on top of the hill. Guess which one they're going to take? They're going to take the magic sword 100 times out of 100. I shouldn't say that. They're going to take it 98 times out of 100. You might get a player like me that goes, oh, you really want me to go pull the sword? I'm going to go herd sheep. But if it's presented in a standard way, what you're going to end up with, they're going to gravitate towards the most interesting thing. Now, let's do the same situation again, where we have the sheep that have escaped, we have the furniture that has been recollected, and we have a woman whose daughter is gotten pregnant, and they want you to find out who the father is. There is not a terribly interesting situation in any of these. And what happens is then players go, that is not over a certain baseline level of expectation. Now, of course, they don't do this consciously. This is a subconscious decision. Well, all right, I guess I'm going to go help the sheep. But then as soon as I find out, oh, the blacksmith is forging these super awesome crafting weapons, I stop caring about the sheep. And now I found something that's interesting. When people leave the plot and go somewhere else, it's because they found something else that is more interesting to them. It is above that certain baseline level of expectation. They will engage with the most interesting thing. The other real common example of this within sandbox games is it happens quite frequently. People set up a town, set them, let's do a convoy mission where you are escorting, the convoy through the wilderness. Good, it's great, it's engaging, it's awesome. And you go through the wilderness and you start learning all the places, and then there's the Mount of Mortal Dragon, where the divine dragon with 7 eyes rests on top of. And you tell the players, you just have to go about that and continue on your escort mission, and it's clearly too high level for you. No, it has just become the single most interesting thing in the world, and they will gravitate towards it. Again, I'm spending a lot of time on this. Players will engage with the most interesting thing. This is a good thing. This is a really good thing. This is how you get them engaged in your plot. You present the plot as the most interesting thing in the world. Don't present flavor text. Don't present the crafting of the town as more interesting than your plot. And I say don't. You certainly can do that, and that is a different play style. But if you want to tell a narrative, if you want to tell a story, if you want your players to tell a story, you present the plot events as the most interesting thing in the world, and they will follow them. If they enter town and there's a whole bunch of merchants selling things here and selling things here, and the guards are beating up a couple merchants, and okay, it's interesting, we're getting our feel, and suddenly we see, directly ahead of us, there is a big crowd and a big conflict in town square. Your players are going to go to town square. Your players are not going to go, let's go deal with the merchants. And that's how you set up these set pieces, which is really important. You make them the most interesting thing going on, not so the players have to go there, but so the players want to go there. And that's how you direct them from one step to another when you are telling a linear style plot. Sandbox plot works a little bit differently, but you still want a progression of plot. And that takes us to the next big thing, which is our 3-act structure. And this is all in establishing our big set pieces. Many of you all, especially if you've done really any amount of writing, I mean, high school, I'm sure, teaches this still. Hopefully I still teach it. And it's the basic 3-act structure of a plot. And a 3-act structure works very simple. The first act of our story is the information act. We are establishing what the world is, who is involved with the world, and what's going on. The second act of the story is where everything starts going right for the heroes. We are building tension towards the finale. They come into town, they kill some of the guards, they rout some of them, they save, the people rejoice, and we're building tension between the heroes and villains because the villains aren't happy now. And then we go into the third act, and the first half of the third act is when the villains strike back, so to speak. They rebound. They take They essentially undo what the players have done. They make it worse. They up the stakes to resulting in the finale and the conclusion of all of this. And that's our basic 3-act structure. It is really easy to do this in a role-playing game. It's not difficult at all. It's really well and pays off to phenomenal effect. And you do exactly that. You set up the events of the first play session to inform your players of what's going on, how the world works, and who's involved with it. We get into town, we hear them tell stories about the guards and about the evil king and about the prince. We get to see that little bit of conflict between the prince and the king. We get to interact with the merchant guild a little bit as our neutral force, and we get to have a big conflict with the guards to see what kind of strength they have. Our first play session, it's built right there. That's what we do. That's what we set up, and it's informative. Now, the next play session, what we're going to do, I should say the next act, it doesn't always break down by play sessions. The next act is our heroes now go, all right, we have to save this town. How are we going to go about doing it? And they enact their plans, and you allow them room in your story. They need to be the ones telling the story. It is their story to go, how are we going to take down, how are we going to handle this situation that was presented to us? And they're going to come up with plans, and they're going to come up with ways, and they're going to come up with different things to do, and you're going to allow them to succeed. Yeah, that's the big kicker. This step 2, you're going to let them win for now, because they're going to fight forward. Their plans are going to work. Everything's going to go great, and they are going to be feeling awesome because they just won. Not won the whole thing, but they scored a victory. They won the battle, as it were. And then when we get into the next act, it all comes rolling back on them. The king brings out his full guard. They lock the town down. They start killing peasants for what's happened bad, who the heroes thought they saved or died. They just come storming back in and completely retake charge of the story. And that gives that sense of dread. That really gives that sense of, well, we thought we won, but now we're not. And from there, what we do is we build up into the finale. Well, now things have gotten worse since the heroes have shown up. Now we have to resolve it. Now we have to resolve our final fight. We have to bring down the king. We have to bring down the prince to end the tyranny. And that's our finale. Pretty straightforward. Different dramatic situations, of course, are going to provide different things. One of the dramatic situations is a political trial. Someone is on trial for a crime. And in that type of situation, you have a very different thing. The finale is essentially the verdict and the carry out of the judgment. The information is gathering stuff on the court case. The first win is the players, coming through and proving their point. The second win is the other people coming back and proving their point, and then ultimate judgment of a finale. They all play out very well within the 3-act structure. They're just, each structure is going to be a little bit different. But when we were establishing our big set pieces, and this is what I wanted to get all of this together to understand, is we know our characters are going to interact with the most interesting thing. We know based on where we are in our 1, 2, 3-act structure, how we want the story to progress, what we want going on, what story we want to tell at this moment. Are we trying to inform? Are we trying to encourage? Are we trying to bring dread? Are we trying to bring finale? Which of these are we trying to tell? And you start to immediately see where big events will occur. You start to see, oh, well, if we need to inform them about the guard and about the oppression, well, we need to show the guards oppressing people. So the guards oppressing the merchants or whoever in town square, and then the players will naturally want to get involved because they're killing, and we have a big battle in town square. We have a set piece. We know it's going to happen. It's not railroading. The players are going to make every single choice along the way, but they see there is the most interesting thing. They're going to decide how they want to engage it. They're going to decide whether they want to sneak around and attack them later. They're going to decide whether they want to directly confront them. They're going to decide whether they want to rally the townspeople behind them. They're going to be able to make all of these choices in how they want to resolve this conflict, but you are going to present them the conflict so that they will engage with it. And you start seeing the set pieces. You start seeing where the king is going to ride back down and say, enough is enough. I'm putting this uprising out. He dresses in full armor like Tywin Lannister and comes straight down and handles business. We see it clear as day. Once we start mapping it out, this is what will happen. And it will bring a very good and very desired result. The other big thing about set pieces, and it's why I call them set pieces and not just events of the story, is the mind works in mysterious ways. And what people really remember about a play session are the extreme high points, the points that were incredibly fun, incredibly dramatic, incredibly tense. You want to intentionally build these into the story. Yes, they happen organically. Players make them themselves. Players make them in ways that you will never be able to understand as a GM. But if you go into a story hoping that your players are going to make the big memories, you're setting everyone up for failure. You want to be able to come in and present a good story to them. You want them to then take your good story and run and take it further. That is what setting up a plot is. And again, I've said some disclaimers before. I'll say it again. This is one play style. This is a heavy narrative play style. There are other play styles that do not, this does not apply to. If you're doing a straight dungeon crawl for treasure, obviously you don't need all of this kind of stuff in it. This is merely a narrative play style. But if you're doing the narrative play style, which a lot of people are nowadays, that's what you want to be setting up. That's what you want to be promoting. That's what you want to be going towards. These big set pieces stand out in people's minds. They went, oh yeah, last session was awesome. We had that, there was we thought we had freedom, and all of a sudden the king came running down, and then he retook the town square, and then he chopped off her head, and the peasant woman that we saved and everything like this. And they go, yeah, we have got to get it. I cannot wait to next play session because I get to rectify that. Or how awesome it was when we saved the townspeople, or how big that fight was in town square where everything went crazy and they released the Minotaur, and all of this kind of stuff happens. You want to make these big set pieces because they will stand out in people's minds and make them keep coming back to the table, because they're getting big payoffs. They're getting these big events to happen. Make sure you are setting up big set pieces in your story for all of these reasons. It moves the story forward. It gives memorable events and experiences. It gets people back to the table. It tells the 3-act structure. Everything builds up well when you do these big, huge, thought out set pieces. So you go through your 3-act structure. We have everything else. We are, at the point now where the we have our, we'll just recap. We have our foundation. We know our metastructure. We have our dramatic situation. We know how long the plot's going to last. We establish the participants of the plot. We identify the core conflict, and then we just built out the big set pieces and the 3-act structure. So now that takes us to step 7, which is designing the finale. And this is a big thing. The finale to the story, to start with, should be the biggest of the set pieces. That's what you're going for. That is, the big, huge thing. It should be the biggest of the big. You shouldn't have, a bigger set piece and then we go down, this is the finale and the story ends. No, this should be the big closeout, blowout, everything's happening, resolving our conflict. This is what everything should build up to. It should tie the threads of the story together. Everything that we've seen throughout the story, the little conflict between the prince and the king, we need to see that. The conflict that we have between the merchant guild and the king, and the merchant guild and the good guys, that needs to come out. It all needs to come through in this story. And if it all comes through in the story, it makes the finale seem bigger. It makes it seem more important. The other really big thing that the finale does, and I touched on this a little bit earlier, is it creates the feeling of accomplishment, that the players have done something, that they have done something meaningful, and they have changed the world. And it gives it to them in one quick dose. At this exact moment, you change the world. You want to play the next 4 or 5 play sessions? You're going to get that exact same moment of change the world again. Now, Jim, and I'm not open, I don't sit and go with my players. Here's the 8 steps to building a plot, unless they watch my videos. But when I do this, I'm training them to a degree, mostly subconsciously, to a small degree consciously, that this is what's going to occur. If you are invested in the story, if you follow in the story, if you take part in it, if you envelop it, if you make it bigger than what it is, if you're invested in all this, there will be a payoff. There will be a huge event, a huge finale. There will be a way to do it, a way to, to be bigger than just the common folk. And that payoff on a subconscious level is what really holds long-term games together. Again, not saying that there aren't people in the world that run, I've talked to people who run 20-year campaigns. I never do establish finales. There's people who do it. But if you're looking from a narrative standpoint, from narrative-focused players, from a narrative-focused campaign, you need to be giving a finale. A finale is essentially a reward in and of itself, shy of whatever else that you give them. It is that sense of accomplishment. The other big thing with the finale, and now we get into sort of some specifics on how we design these, the PCs must be the one that resolve the conflict. PCs must resolve conflict. And what I mean by that is it cannot resolve by happenstance. It cannot resolve by predestined. So if there was the same story with the king and everything that we've been talking about up to this point, and the players ultimately have their fight with the king. Now, as they're fighting with the king, they find out that the reason the king is so angry is because he has this spell placed on him and his body is slowly dissolving away to dust. And in the fight, you outlast him just long enough until his body completely dissolves to dust and his immortality fades. The PCs did nothing. It's what's called a shallow victory. They got what they wanted, but when they sit there and think about it for even a second, they go, well, if we didn't show up, the king still would have died. The oppression still would have ended. Maybe the prince would still be here. But the main resolve of the conflict, the PCs did not resolve it. The PCs merely were there to witness its resolution. The exact same thing if you have one of the powerful neutral forces, maybe it's instead of a merchant's guild, maybe it's an assassin's guild, maybe it's, whatever. And they come, and they take out the king. There's no good resolution. The players aren't the ones that changed the world merely changed. And to have the finale be a reward, the players must do it. So that's the big thing to understand. Do not set up a situation where you establish a finale and then have something else that is not the players resolve it. That is essentially, of course, many people know the term Deus Ex Machina. To a degree, that's what's happening. I mean, there's a little bit more with a Deus Ex in that. Technically, a Deus Ex, you've never seen it happen before. It just almost literally falls out of the sky and then resolves conflict for you. But it's that level of disappointment is heavily tied in with the fact that you don't have players resolving the story. If they didn't resolve it, what were they doing for the last 4 to 5 play sessions? There to witness what the DM told? No. The story, despite everything else what this may sound like, in 8 steps to building it, the story is the player's story, and the story is for the player's entertainment, and the story is for the players to resolve. You as the DM are presenting the conflict, and that's what these 8 steps are, the way to build up conflict in a way that works and engages people. So players need to resolve the story, one of the big things. The other thing we're going to touch on for a second here is the use of a twist. And of course, M. Night Shyamalan, what a twist. We're all familiar with that now. We know basically what a twist of a story is. Twists can be used very well, and twists can be used very poorly. This is not shocking information. I want to establish what makes a good twist and what makes a bad twist, because there is a big difference. And most people understand when they like it and when they don't like it, but a lot of people have a hard time understanding why. The reason, what you're going for with a plot twist, something that changes, the dynamic of what the viewing audience, or in course, our case, the individual players, what changes their perspective of the world is a twist. An effective twist adds information to everything that happens before. A bad twist removes information or removes relevance of information from what happened before. Again, one more time, a good twist adds information to everything that has happened. A bad twist removes information from what's happened, or relevance. Let's look at a couple of these. One, we mentioned M. Night Shyamalan, and we're going to go from the movie world. Hopefully most people know this. There's a movie called The Village, and spoiler alert, it's been out for 10 years or whatever now, so if you haven't seen it, too bad. I'm going to ruin it for you. It's a village where a whole bunch of creepy stuff is going on in this isolated, it's an old-timey, colonial type village. Of course, heavy religion, everything of that. And in the story, you start seeing, more and more odd things happen. There's sort of a plot that comes and resolves. There's don't go into the woods. There's all of this stuff. And then when you get to the end, the twist ending is that this movie happened in real life. That they were in modern day world. The last shot, I believe, is actually the lady walks up and there's a road with a car driving by it. Twist, cut to black. I think that's how the movie ended. It's been a while. That's the big twist. Here's the problem with that is, well, in some ways you could go, it added information. It's why they didn't want him going into the woods, etc. It removed the relevance of everything that happened in the story. Everything about the struggle, to continue life, the struggle for existence that they show within it is all irrelevant. All of the creepy stuff is irrelevant because it just happened because, and the story holds less meaning. The other similar story, I see it a lot. I look at a lot of amateur writing. And with amateur writing, a twist story that I saw is, and I've seen this done in tabletop as well, a dream sequence beginning. Everything that happened in a dream or in a coma, and then you wake up from the story. Common plot people try and shoehorn in. It's a bad idea. It's a bad twist, because what's happening is, yes, you drop in your little clues that you're actually awake, or please wake up, or whatever people are chanting, but once they wake up, everything that happened in the dream sequence was irrelevant other than waking up. You're making the entire sequence irrelevant. That's the sign of a bad twist. A good twist, a good plot twist. I'm going to use the example of Fight Club. Again, hopefully a movie that everyone's seen. Fight Club, it's a long story, and honestly, Polinick's book is better than the movie. I'm a big fan of Polinick. But in Fight Club, the story is you've got two characters that essentially establish a fight club. Ultimately, they blow up a whole bunch of buildings. We're going to do the movie version because the book is different. And the big twist that you get is the fact that both of these characters are the same person. Now, what that twist did is every single scene that you look at before it adds information to that. There's this whole scene where one wants to brand the other, and the other one, he's already branded himself. The other one doesn't want to be branded. He's like, no, you're crazy. He eventually talks him into doing it, and he brands himself. It's a good, powerful scene in and of itself. We get to rewatch that then with foreknowledge and go, oh, wow, he had already made the decision because he was already branded. He was branded as Ham. It added information every single step of the way through that twist. It added more to each individual scene as opposed to took relevance away. So I wanted to put that in there because a lot of people really try to work the earth-shattering twist in there, and that's the metric that you need to use. Does this add information to every scene, or does this detract from information from every scene? That is the metric of a good or a bad twist. So I won't harp anymore on that, but the twist can be used very, very powerfully, or it can be used very poorly. The other thing, all right, we're still, of course, talking about finales here. When establishing a finale, of course, I've given you the roadmap, the 3-act structure, the 7 steps up into this point to make your finale. The one thing to understand is if you're not going to follow a roadmap like I've presented, epicness. A lot of people really try for this epic. I want a big finale that feels huge. And the way you do that is through proper storytelling. It's through using a structure to make people have emotional investment in the outcome of these events. What does not create epicness is time or repetition of events. One of the classic tropes that's been used, of course, in tabletop forever is, the villain shows up twirling his mustache and sends his henchmen and then runs away. Then the villain shows up again and twirls his mustache and sends henchmen and goes on. And then by the time you get to fight him, it's supposed to be epic because you've encountered him so many times. No, repetition and time do not create epicness. Emotional investment in outcome is what creates the feel of epicness. And that's another big thing you're going for in the finale, that feeling of that. And to establish it, you have to develop that emotional connection. Your players had to be involved with the plot. They had to be involved every step of the way. They had to affect the story every step of the way. And that gets them to a state where they're emotionally invested. Having stuff happen to them repeatedly from the villain doesn't do it. They have to be involved. They have to be invested. So those are the big things that we're looking for, when we're designing our finale. Obviously, then you get into the BBEG himself, our big bad evil guy, and that is a workshop unto itself, the correct way to formulate one of those through the story. But the big thing to understand is he needs to be the biggest, baddest of them all. He needs to be the antithesis of what your players want to do, and that will drive them further even to a fight with him or whatever the conflict resolution, not necessarily always a fight. The last step after the finale, because there's one more after the finale, and that is our future plot tie-ins. Our future plot tie-ins is where we take the story that we've developed, and we have it all now. We have our metastructure, we have our dramatic situation, we know how long it's going to last, we've established our 7 participants of the plot, we have identified the core conflict, we have just done our set pieces, and we've designed our finale. And now we need to make sure all of this works to tack on another story arc after it. And how we do this is we set up future plot tie-ins throughout the story. And I put this as the last step because I literally go back and do this at the end. I've crafted the whole story, but what I want is keys and clues to the next story thrown throughout it. So certain things that I will do is, one of the things I did was mysterious green coins. No other relevance, didn't match any other currency in the land. No one knew what they were. But as the players went through the story, they kept finding these green coins on various dead people. So peasants that were killed off, guards that were killed off. And kind of throughout the story, they didn't know, what this was. It just was something that kept coming up. And they were interested in it because it was obscure, because it was interesting, because it was a mysterious green coin that doesn't match any currency, is really interesting compared to a pile of dead bodies. It drew their attention. Then at the end, after the finale, after, in this case, well, it was a void Shugenja, but for non-L5R people, it's a magic user. It is, they found essentially notes and a stack of these things that then led to that this was all being done by someone else. It was being paid off by someone else. There was another motivation behind it. And that then goes, now we have tie-in to the next story. That is our wild card force. And I normally try and give it some sort of physical face. The example I gave, of course, was just coins. But a lot of times I will have some kind of NPC in the world that will then either be the villain or an ally in the next story. And they get to encounter him and engage him, and he's doing whatever will be appropriate for the next story involved, but it will give them something to tie into the next story arc. So it's not, feels like start, come to a complete halt. Start, come to a complete halt. Instead, you're going to have beginning, conflict resolution, and it's going to stay high, and it's going to keep going on to the next story, and on to the next story, and on to the next story. It will keep going throughout, and that's how you set your future plot tie-ins. You want to set the wild card, that 7th force, in motion to just tickle their interest a little bit. That something more is going on. Maybe this is the guy that talks cryptic. Maybe it's a coin. Again, maybe it's some scholar that talks about information. You're going to want something that you're going to establish, because then when you present the next story arc to them, they are going to have already a basis in this world to follow. Now, I will say this. I always try and plan one of these into my story. I end up using it maybe 50% of the time. And the reason being, because the players, and any experienced GM knows this, the players will find something interesting in the world that was never meant to be interesting and attach themselves to it. Despite all of the, making them the most interested thing, they will always find something absurd. For me, if there is a library and there is, the child that has to run and fetch me all the books, for some reason, every time I play a story, I always want to turn that child into an epic hero. And I'm like, he's going to come with us on our group. And for some reason, that's what I get attached to. Everyone, of course, is different on this. What you're going to find is I always try and have it. So if the players don't come up with anything on their own, I have something already built in. But if the players find something better, I can drop my thing, or I can take and attach it to what they say. Maybe they got attached to the blacksmith and his backstory. Well, then we find out that the blacksmith is the one minting these green coins for someone else. Now I've taken my plot thread, I've taken what interests them, and I just merged them together and have my future plot tie-in. But I personally always try and establish something. That way there will be, if the players themselves do not come up with something, there will be something to tie them into. There we go. That's our 8 steps to building a plot. Let me just recap it here real quick for you all. And again, one last sort of asterisk fine print at the bottom. This is a play style. This is heavily engaged in the narrative type of fun, because there's 8 types of fun. And if you're interested in the 8 types of fun, check out the next workshop that starts in about an hour. But this is heavily engaged in the narrative types of fun and running a plot. Yes, this can be used for a dungeon crawl. It can be used for a linear plot. It can be used for a mini sandbox, and it absolutely can be used for a true sandbox. How you work all that in together, again, a workshop for another time. But this structure very much can work with any single play style. And what you do, step one, we establish our metastructure. Step two, we establish what the dramatic situation is. Step three, how long is this story arc going to last? Again, not the huge overarching campaign, but this one story arc, how long is it going to last? We establish that. Step four is establishing our participants of the plot, who's all involved, our 7 forces. Step 5 is identifying the core conflict, which there needs to be direct conflict that can only be resolved through some sort of interesting situation between our heroes and between our villains. So we need to identify that core conflict. Step 6 is set up our big set pieces. This is our 3-act structure. We start with information and informative. Then we start with the heroes getting their way. Then the villains turn the tables, leading into a finale. The basic 3-act structure. Through that, all the way to step 7, our finale, which needs to be epic. It needs to be dramatic. It needs to be the biggest of the set pieces, and the players need to resolve it for a sense of accomplishment. And then once we see how it all plays out, then we look at how we want to tie in our next story, our step 8, our future plot tie-ins. Well, there we go. It's been a wonderful hour talking about plot. I hope you all have got enjoyment. I hope you all got some education. By all means, you can post in this thread afterwards, or of course, this will be up on the GM Academy YouTube video for more information or questions. Certainly, there's a lot to this topic, and I try to get through as much as I can, but there's just a lot to it in an hour. I highly encourage you, again, within 1 hour from now, I'm going to be starting another one of these workshops. It'll also be an hour long, and it's on understanding player types. And because 8's the magic number today, it's really going to focus on the 8 kinds of fun. Yes, there are 8 kinds of fun to be had. But yes, that's the one for the next one. Again, I've been Jim McClure. I'm the content director of the GM Academy. This has been 8 Steps to Building a Plot. I hope you all enjoyed yourself.